I never thought I'd be in a position where I needed to pull out legal paperwork to defend myself in someone else's kitchen. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, especially in the real estate business. My name is Alex Morgan, and I've been a real estate agent in the suburbs of Boston for nearly 15 years. The housing market here has always been competitive, but what happened last spring was unlike anything I'd experienced before. It all started with a charming colonial on Maple Street. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, with original hardwood floors and a recently renovated kitchen that was to die for. The owners, the Harrisons, were a couple in their 60s who had raised their family there and were finally downsizing to a condo in Florida. Their daughter Jessica was handling most of the sale details since her parents had already relocated. When I first met Jessica, she seemed pleasant enough, professional, straightforward, and apparently eager to get the house sold quickly. "My parents just want to move on," she had told me during our initial consultation. "They've already found their dream retirement place, and they don't want to be paying 2 mortgages for long." I nodded sympathetically. "I completely understand. With the current market, I'm confident we can sell quickly at a good price. The renovated kitchen alone will attract plenty of buyers." Jessica beamed with pride. "I should hope so. I designed that kitchen myself. I'm an interior designer, and I convinced my parents to let me update it before listing. It's top of the line, custom cabinets, quartz countertops, a farmhouse sink. The works. It shows," I said, genuinely impressed. "That kitchen is going to be a major selling point." We listed the house on a Thursday, and by Saturday morning we had 7 offers, 3 of them above asking price. The Harrisons were thrilled, and we accepted an offer from a young couple, the Walkers, who had fallen in love with the property, especially that kitchen. Everything was proceeding smoothly until the home inspection. The inspector found some minor issues, a few loose shingles, some outdated electrical wiring in the basement, nothing major. But then he discovered something concerning in the kitchen. "This sink wasn't properly installed," he told me as we stood in the gleaming kitchen. "The plumbing doesn't meet code, and there's evidence of a slow leak that could cause serious damage, if not addressed." I immediately called Jessica to discuss the findings. "We'll need to get a licensed plumber in to fix the sink installation," I explained. "The buyers are requesting it be done before closing." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That's impossible," Jessica finally said, her voice tight. "There's nothing wrong with that sink. I supervised the installation myself." "I understand this is frustrating," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But the inspector found clear evidence of a problem. We can get a second opinion if you'd like." "That won't be necessary," she snapped. "I'll handle it myself. I know people who can fix it for less than what a plumber would charge." Warning bells went off in my head. "Jessica, for the sale to proceed, we need to use licensed professionals and get proper documentation that the work was completed to code." "Fine," she huffed. "I'll take care of it." 2 days later, Jessica texted me that the sink had been fixed and the paperwork would be ready for me to pick up that afternoon. I arrived at the house around 4, expecting to collect the documentation and be on my way. Instead, I found Jessica in the kitchen with a man who was still working under the sink. "I thought you said it was already fixed," I said, trying to keep the confusion out of my voice. Jessica waved a dismissive hand. "Almost done. This is my cousin Mike. He's practically a plumber." I felt my stomach drop. "Jessica, we discussed this. We need a licensed professional." "Mike knows what he's doing," she interrupted. "Besides, it's just a simple fix. No need to waste money on overpriced plumbers." I took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, but the buyers specifically requested that any repairs be done by licensed professionals. It's in the contract that your parents signed." Jessica's face hardened. "My parents signed whatever I told them to sign. This is my project, and I'm handling it my way." I pulled out my phone. "I think I should call your parents to discuss this." That's when things really went south. Jessica stepped toward me, her eyes flashing with anger. "You need to leave now." "Jessica, I'm just trying to make sure we fulfill our obligations for the sale. This is my parents' house, and I'm telling you to get out of my kitchen." Her voice had risen to a shout. Her cousin Mike had stopped working and was watching us with wide eyes. I stood my ground. Actually, according to the sale contract, this kitchen and this entire house are currently under agreement with the Walkers, pending these repairs being completed properly. I reached into my bag and pulled out the sales contract, flipping to the relevant section. Right here it clearly states that all repairs requested after inspection must be completed by licensed professionals with proper documentation. Your parents agreed to these terms. Jessica's face flushed dark red. How dare you come into my family home and tell me what to do? My parents built this house, my children grew up here. I designed this kitchen. I understand you have a strong emotional attachment to this house, I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite my racing heart. But your parents have legally agreed to sell it, and there are specific conditions that need to be met for that sale to go through. Jessica stepped closer, and for a moment, I thought she might actually shove me. Get out! Her voice was low and dangerous. I had never been in a situation quite like this before. Normally I would have backed off and tried to resolve things through phone calls and emails later. But something about Jessica's attitude, the way she was trying to cut corners on important repairs, her complete disregard for the legal agreement her parents had signed, made me hold my ground. I'm not leaving until we discuss how we're going to properly address the sink issue, I said firmly. The buyers are scheduled for their final walkthrough tomorrow, and they'll want to see documentation that the repairs were done correctly. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see the calculations happening behind her eyes. Finally, her shoulders slumped slightly. Fine, she muttered. What exactly do we need? I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We need a licensed plumber to fix the sink properly and provide documentation that the work has been done to code. I can call someone who might be able to come first thing tomorrow morning. Jessica glanced at her cousin. Sorry, Mike. Looks like we need to call in the professionals after all. Mike shrugged and began gathering his tools. No skin off my back. I told you that leak looked serious anyway. As Mike packed up, I stepped outside to call a plumber I'd worked with before. He agreed to come at 7 a.m. the next morning, which would give us just enough time before the Walkers' final walkthrough at noon. When I came back inside, Jessica was alone in the kitchen, sitting at the island with her head in her hands. It's all set for tomorrow morning, I told her. She nodded without looking up. I just wanted everything to be perfect, she said quietly. This kitchen was my gift to my parents before they sold. I wanted them to get top dollar. I felt a twinge of sympathy. The house did get top dollar. The Walkers fell in love with it, kitchen and all. We just need to make sure everything is up to code so they can love it for years to come. Jessica finally looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. I'm sorry I yelled at you. This house, it's hard to let go. I understand, I said, and I truly did. I'd seen many families struggle with selling long-time homes, but your parents are moving on to their next adventure, and so is this house. Let's make sure we do right by both. She nodded slowly. Okay, I'll be here tomorrow morning for the plumber. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how quickly things had escalated and how differently they might have gone if I hadn't stood my ground. In real estate, you're not just dealing with properties. You're dealing with people's homes, their memories, their emotions. Sometimes the hardest part of my job isn't negotiating prices or navigating inspections. It's helping people let go. Little did I know, the sink was just the beginning of our problems. The next morning I arrived at the house at 6:45 a.m., coffee in hand and contract tucked safely in my bag. The early morning air was crisp, and dew still clung to the perfectly manicured lawn. I had hoped to beat Jessica there to have a moment alone with the plumber, but her sleek black SUV was already in the driveway. As I approached the front door, I heard voices raised in argument coming from inside. I hesitated, key in hand, wondering if I should give them a moment. But time was of the essence. The Walkers would be arriving for their final walkthrough in just a few hours. I knocked firmly before using my key. "Hello, it's Alex," I called out as I stepped inside. The voices immediately hushed. I made my way to the kitchen to find Jessica standing with an older man I didn't recognize. Both turned to look at me with expressions that made my stomach drop. "Alex," Jessica said stiffly, "this is my father, Richard Harrison." I blinked in surprise. Mr. Harrison, it's nice to finally meet you in person. I thought you and your wife were already in Florida. Richard Harrison was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of deep tan that comes from retirement in the Sunshine State. His expression was thunderous. We were, he said curtly, until I got a call from our family lawyer last night saying there might be a problem with the sale of our house. I frowned, confused. A problem? Everything's on track as far as I know. We're just taking care of the sink repair this morning, and then the final walkthrough is at noon. Richard crossed his arms. That's not what I heard. Our lawyer says there's an issue with the kitchen, something about it not being up to code. Jessica assured us everything was perfect when we left. I glanced at Jessica, whose face had gone pale. She avoided my eyes. There was a minor issue discovered during the inspection, I explained carefully. The kitchen sink wasn't properly installed, and there's evidence of a leak. We have a plumber coming this morning to fix it before the final walkthrough. Richard's eyes narrowed. A minor issue. My lawyer says it could jeopardize the entire sale if not addressed properly. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. That must be the plumber, I said, relieved for the interruption. Shall I let him in? Richard nodded curtly, and I went to open the door. Jim, my trusted plumber, greeted me with a smile that quickly faded when he sensed the tension in the house. Morning, Alex. Everything okay? He asked quietly as I led him inside. Just a little miscommunication, I murmured. The kitchen's this way. When we returned to the kitchen, Richard and Jessica were standing in tense silence. I made quick introductions, and Jim, ever the professional, immediately got to work examining the sink. After a few minutes, he emerged from under the cabinet with a grim expression. This is worse than I thought, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Whoever installed this sink did it completely wrong. The P-trap is improperly configured, there's no air gap for the dishwasher, and that leak has caused some mold growth on the underside of the counter. Jessica made a small, distressed sound. Jim continued, addressing Richard directly. Sir, this is going to take more than a quick fix. I'll need to reconfigure the plumbing, treat the mold, and possibly replace a section of the countertop if the water damage is extensive. Richard's face turned an alarming shade of red. And how much is that going to cost? Jim hesitated. Without seeing the full extent of the damage, I'd estimate between $1,500 and $2,000. $2,000, Richard exploded. For a sink that was just installed 3 months ago. He turned to Jessica. You told me you had professionals do this work. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. I did. I mean, Carlo said he'd done plenty of kitchen renovations before. Carlo? Richard's voice rose even higher. Your boyfriend, Carlo? The art teacher? He's not a licensed contractor, Jessica. I felt like I was watching a family drama unfold that I had no business witnessing, but I couldn't exactly leave. The final walkthrough was in a few hours, and we needed to resolve this situation fast. Mr. Harrison, I interjected gently, I understand this is frustrating, but the important thing now is to get this fixed properly before the buyers arrive. According to the sales contract, these repairs need to be completed to code. Richard turned his glare on me. And where were you when my daughter was having unqualified people work on this house? Aren't you supposed to be overseeing this process? I felt my professional composure slipping. With all due respect, Mr. Harrison, I'm your real estate agent, not your contractor. The kitchen renovation was completed before you even listed the house with me. I had no involvement in or knowledge of who did that work. Richard scoffed. Convenient excuse. Jessica stepped forward. Dad, stop. This isn't Alex's fault. I wanted to surprise you and Mom with the kitchen renovation. I knew Carlo wasn't licensed, but he offered to do it for just the cost of materials, and I was trying to save you money. Richard's anger seemed to deflate slightly. He ran a hand through his silver hair. Jessica, we could have paid for proper contractors. This house is our biggest investment. I know, she whispered. I'm sorry. Jim, who had been quietly assessing the situation under the sink, stood up. I hate to interrupt, but we're on a tight timeline here. I can fix this, but I need to get started right away, and I'll need to run to my supplier for some parts. Richard nodded stiffly. Do what needs to be done. He turned to me. And I suppose we're responsible for covering this cost? I nodded. According to the contract, yes. Any repairs required after inspection are the seller's responsibility. Richard pulled out his phone. I'm calling our lawyer. I want to make sure everything is being handled properly. He stepped out of the kitchen, phone to his ear. Jessica sank onto one of the bar stools, looking defeated. I was just trying to help, she murmured. I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me sympathized with her intention to help her parents, but another part was frustrated by the corner-cutting that had created this mess in the first place. Jim gave me a look that clearly said, I'll get to work. You handle the people. He began laying out tools and measuring the space under the sink. The doorbell rang again, startling us all. Are you expecting someone else? I asked Jessica. She shook her head, looking confused. I went to answer the door and found myself face to face with a middle-aged man in a polo shirt and khakis, holding a clipboard. Can I help you? I asked. Brian Walsh, building inspector for the town of Brookfield, he said, showing me an ID badge. We received a complaint about unpermitted work at this address. My heart sank. This was exactly what we didn't need right now. May I come in? He asked, his expression neutral but firm. Of course, I said, stepping aside. There was no point in trying to turn him away. That would only make things worse. As I led him to the kitchen, my mind raced. Who had called the building inspector? Had Jessica's cousin reported her out of spite after being dismissed yesterday? Or was this just horrifically bad timing? When we entered the kitchen, Jessica took one look at Brian's clipboard and official polo and seemed to physically shrink. Ms. Harrison? Brian asked, looking at Jessica. She nodded weakly. I'm here because we received a complaint about renovation work being done without proper permits. Specifically, a kitchen remodel? At that moment, Richard walked back into the kitchen, still on his phone. He stopped short when he saw Brian. I'll call you back, he said into the phone before hanging up. What's going on now? I quickly explained the situation, watching Richard's face grow increasingly stormy. Brian was professionally detached as he began his inspection, asking to see permits and documentation for the kitchen renovation. Of course, there were none to provide. I'm going to have to write this up, Brian said after examining the kitchen. Renovations of this scale require permits, inspections, and licensed contractors. Based on what I'm seeing, none of those protocols were followed. What does that mean for us? Richard asked, his voice tight. Brian's expression was sympathetic, but firm. It means you'll need to retroactively apply for permits, have everything inspected, and bring any substandard work up to code. There will also be fines for the unpermitted work. And the sale of the house? I asked, dreading the answer. That's complicated, Brian admitted. Legally, you can't sell a house with unpermitted work without disclosure, since you're already under contract. You'll need to disclose this to the buyers immediately. They would have the right to back out of the sale if they choose. I felt the blood drain from my face. The Walkers were due here in less than 3 hours for what they thought was a routine final walkthrough. Now we had to tell them that the kitchen they had fallen in love with was illegally renovated, riddled with code violations and potentially dangerous. Richard turned to Jessica, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. Do you have any idea what you've done? Jessica didn't answer. She just stared blankly at the beautiful kitchen that was supposed to be her gift to her parents, the kitchen that was now threatening to derail everything. Jim the plumber cleared his throat. For what it's worth, I can fix the plumbing issues. To code. It won't solve the permit problem, but at least the sink will be safe and functional. Brian nodded. That would be a start. But you'll still need electrical inspections, structural assessments if any walls were moved, and proper documentation for all materials used. My phone buzzed with a text. It was from the Walkers. Looking forward to the final walkthrough. We're so excited. I stared at my phone, feeling sick. What were we going to do? Richard seemed to read my expression. The buyers? He asked. I nodded. He squared his shoulders. Let me see that contract again. I pulled the sale contract from my bag and handed it to him. He flipped through it methodically until he found what he was looking for. Here, he said, pointing to a clause. It states that the seller warrants all improvements to the property have been made in accordance with proper permits and local building codes. That's a warranty we can't make now. He looked up at me, his expression grim. "We're in breach of contract." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. A breach of contract could not only kill this sale, but could potentially lead to legal action from the buyers. "There must be something we can do," I said, trying to think quickly. "What if we offer to cover the cost of bringing everything up to code? We could delay closing if necessary." Richard shook his head. "These buyers were in a hurry to close. They've already given notice at their apartment. They wanted this house because it was move-in ready." He sighed deeply. "No. We need to be upfront about this. They deserve to know what they're getting into." I admired his integrity, even as I worried about how the Walkers would react. Brian, the building inspector, cleared his throat. "If I may make a suggestion, I've seen situations like this before. Sometimes, if the buyers are still interested, despite the issues, we can work out a conditional occupancy permit while the necessary work is being completed." It wasn't ideal, but it was something. "Thank you," I said to Brian. "That's helpful to know." Richard nodded grimly. "Let's get Jim started on fixing the sink at least, and I need to call our lawyer back." As Richard stepped out of the room again, Jessica finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen. I just wanted to help." I looked at her, this woman who had designed a beautiful but deeply flawed kitchen, who had tried to save her parents' money by cutting corners, who had yelled at me just yesterday for trying to follow proper procedures. "I know you didn't," I said softly, "but this is why processes and regulations exist. They're not just bureaucratic red tape. They're protections. For your parents, for the buyers, for everyone involved." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Jim had already begun working on the sink, his tools clanking as he removed the improperly installed fixtures. Brian was making notes on his clipboard, occasionally taking photos. And I was left standing in the middle of the kitchen, contract in hand, wondering how I was going to explain all of this to the excited young couple who thought they were just hours away from taking possession of their dream home. In real estate, they say expect the unexpected, but some days that saying feels woefully inadequate. The hands on my watch seemed to be moving at double speed as we scrambled to address as much as we could before the Walkers arrived. Jim worked diligently on the sink while Richard made a flurry of calls to his lawyer, to his wife, and finally to a contractor friend in Florida who might be able to recommend someone local to handle the remaining issues. Jessica had retreated to the living room, seemingly unable to bear witnessing the dismantling of her kitchen project. Building Inspector Brian had left after completing his report, but not before giving us his card and explaining the process for retroactively obtaining permits. "What's our game plan here?" I asked Richard as noon approached. "The Walkers will be here any minute." Richard ran a hand over his weary face. "My lawyer says we need to be completely transparent. We disclose everything, offer to cover all costs to bring the kitchen up to code, and give them the option to back out of the sale with their earnest money returned in full." I nodded. It was the right approach, ethically and legally, but I couldn't help worrying about how devastating it would be for both parties if the sale fell through. The Harrisons had already purchased their retirement home in Florida, and the Walkers had given notice at their apartment. "Do you want me to do the talking?" I offered. Richard shook his head. "No, this is my responsibility as the homeowner, but I'd appreciate you being here to answer any questions about the contract or the real estate aspects." At precisely noon, the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath and went to answer it, plastering on a professional smile that I hoped didn't look as strained as it felt. Sarah and David Walker stood on the doorstep, practically vibrating with excitement. Sarah was clutching a measuring tape and a notebook, presumably filled with furniture placement ideas and paint swatches. "Alex, we're so excited," Sarah gushed as I led them inside. "We've been counting down the days," David nodded enthusiastically. "We've already ordered some furniture that's being delivered next week after we move in." My heart sank further. "Before we start the walkthrough, there's something we need to discuss. Mr. Harrison, the homeowner, is here and would like to speak with you." Their smiles faltered slightly, but they followed me to the living room where Richard was waiting. Jessica was nowhere to be seen. She had apparently decided to make herself scarce for this conversation. After introductions, Richard got straight to the point. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker, I'm afraid we've discovered a serious issue that I'm obligated to disclose to you before we proceed with this sale." The Walkers exchanged worried glances as Richard explained about the unpermitted kitchen renovation, the code violations, and the visit from the building inspector. He laid out everything honestly, sparing no details about the potential costs and complications. "We are prepared to cover all expenses to bring everything up to code," Richard concluded. "But given these circumstances, you would be well within your rights to walk away from this sale. We would, of course, return your earnest money in full." Sarah. And David sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then David spoke up, his voice measured. "May we see the kitchen? I'd like to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Richard nodded, and we all moved to the kitchen where Jim was still working. The previously pristine space was now in disarray, with tools scattered about, and the cabinet under the sink dismantled. Jim emerged from under the counter when he heard, "Just enter." "The good news is I've got the plumbing sorted," he said. "Properly configured now with an air gap for the dishwasher and all connections sealed correctly. No more leaks." "And the mold?" Richard asked. "Minimal, thankfully. I've treated the affected area, but you'll want to have it tested to be sure." David, who apparently had some construction knowledge, began asking Jim detailed questions about what had been done wrong and what had been fixed. Sarah walked slowly around the kitchen, running her hand along the quartz countertops that had initially captivated her. "It really is a beautiful kitchen," she said softly. "It's exactly what we wanted." I held my breath, not daring to hope. After a thorough discussion with Jim, David rejoined his wife. They stepped aside for a private conversation, speaking in hushed tones with serious expressions. Richard and I exchanged anxious glances, both of us trying not to eavesdrop but desperately, wanting to know which way they were leaning. Finally, they turned back to us. "We've talked it over," David said, his expression unreadable, "and we have a proposal." Richard straightened. "I'm listening." "We still want the house," Sarah said, and I felt a surge of relief. "But we need some assurances." David nodded. "We propose pushing back the closing by 2 weeks to allow time for the proper permits to be filed and initial inspections to be completed. We want documentation of all the work that's being done to bring things up to code, and we want to be kept in the loop throughout the process." "That seems more than reasonable," Richard said, visibly relieved. "There's more," David continued. "We'll need a significant escrow account established at closing, let's say $20,000, to cover any additional issues that might be discovered once walls start getting opened up. Any unused funds would be returned to you once all inspections are passed." Richard hesitated, then nodded. "I can agree to that. And finally," Sarah added, "we'd like to have our own contractor come through to give us an independent assessment. If they find anything concerning that hasn't been addressed, we reserve the right to renegotiate or walk away." I glanced at Richard, who was clearly weighing this last condition carefully. Finally, he extended his hand to David. "You've got a deal." The relief in the room was palpable as they shook on it. It wasn't the smooth final walkthrough any of us had envisioned, but it was a path forward. As we continued with a modified version of the walkthrough, I pulled out my notebook and began drafting an addendum to the purchase agreement that would formalize these new terms. The Walkers, now fully aware of what they were getting into, still moved through the house with excitement, measuring spaces and discussing where their furniture would go. When we reached the master bedroom, Sarah turned to me with a curious expression. "You know, most agents I know would have tried to minimize this whole situation. You and Mr. Harrison have been remarkably forthcoming." I smiled ruefully. In real estate, honesty isn't just the right thing to do, it's the only sustainable approach. Problems have a way of surfacing eventually. "Well, we appreciate it," David said. "It actually gives us more confidence in the purchase, knowing that you're being so transparent." After the Walkers left with the addendum signed and a new closing date set, Richard collapsed onto a kitchen stool with a heavy sigh. "That went better than I had any right to expect," he said. I nodded. "The Walkers are reasonable people and they really love this house. No thanks to Jessica's improvements," Richard muttered, then immediately looked regretful. That wasn't fair, she was trying to help in her own way. Speaking of Jessica, she cautiously re-entered the kitchen. "Is it over? Did they back out?" Richard shook his head. No, they're still buying the house, but it's going to cost us about $20,000 in escrow, plus whatever it takes to bring your kitchen up to code. Jessica winced. I'm so sorry, Dad. Richard's expression softened. I know you are, sweetheart, and the kitchen is beautiful. I'll give you that. Just, next time, leave the plumbing to the professionals, okay? A tentative smile crossed Jessica's. Fausimut deal. As I packed up my things to leave, Richard walked me to the door. Thank you, Alex, for standing your ground yesterday with Jessica, and for handling today with such professionalism. Just doing my job, I said, though his words meant more to me than he probably realized. No, Richard said firmly. Many agents would have tried to paper over the problems or convince us to be less forthcoming. You did right by everyone involved, even when it wasn't easy. I thanked him and headed to my car, feeling a complex mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The day had been a roller coaster, but we had found a path forward that preserved both the sale and our integrity. In the following weeks, I oversaw a flurry of activity at the house. Licensed contractors came in to properly redo much of Jessica's kitchen work. Permits were filed, inspections conducted, and documentation meticulously gathered. The Walkers' independent contractor confirmed our findings, but found no additional major issues. On our new closing day, as I handed the keys to Sarah and David Walker, there was a sense of hard-won accomplishment that went beyond the typical satisfaction of completing a sale. We can't thank you enough, Alex, Sarah said, clutching the keys with obvious joy. This could have been a disaster, but instead you're getting a house with a fully permitted, professionally renovated kitchen that's actually up to code, I finished for her with a smile. Enjoy your new home. As I drove away from the house on Maple Street for the last time, I reflected on the lessons of the past month. In real estate, as in life, cutting corners rarely pays off. Doing things the right way might take more time, effort, and money up front, but it saves immeasurable headaches down the road. And sometimes, standing your ground and pulling out a contract is exactly what a situation calls for, even if it means an uncomfortable moment in someone else's kitchen.